partners at Happy Badger Studio. I am also one of the co-founders and partners at software development firm Rampant Interactive, and I am one of the co-founders and coordinators of the St. Louis Game Developers Co-op, which is a nonprofit organization started here in St. Louis to help support, provide resources, and provide event opportunities for game developers in the city. So, with that, like, why were we here? Why are we all here? Let's just kind of clear the air. I know that the panel is called "Can Games Change the World?" But spoilers, yes, they can, and that's what we're here to talk about. So,
because that goes. I didn't prepare for that.
I'm not ready.
So, in just a few decades, the game industry has become one of the youngest yet largest creative industries. There are more than 1.2 billion people. 1.2 billion people, that's 40% of the population in the world, who play games. In 2015, the video game industry alone was estimated to be worth over $90 billion. Add the tabletop game industry into that, and that's another $1 billion. So that's pretty big. As games as a creative medium grows and evolves, game creators are finding new ways to innovate and communicate with interactivity like never ever before. This evening we've gotten together a panel of local game industry professionals to have a conversation that explores games and their impact on culture and other industries. We're going to talk a little bit about these topics, and then afterward, if we have time, we're going to open it up to Q&A so that we can address any questions that you all may have during the conversation. So with that, I'd like the panelists to briefly introduce yourselves and your role in the game industry.
Yeah, I'm Rob Santos. I work in the industry from a variety of angles. I work downtown with Pixel Press, where we make games that scan drawings and building blocks and turn those into creative experiences. I also run my own game development company where we focus on social multiplayer experiences. My ask wasn't multiplayer social. We're trying to backtrack from this kind of stereotype that multiplayer in games means you're glued to a TV isolated with a headset. I think it needs to go the other way and be more people-focused. And then I'll also be teaching video game history at Webster University this semester, hopefully encouraging discussions like these.
Can you all hear us okay?
No.
No. All right. Let's have the Is Travis here? Is anybody?
Can you speak louder, maybe?
Try it louder.
All right, just speak up, guys. Yes.
All right, so
I did this about a year ago.
hi, my name is Jamie Madigan, and I think I'm here tonight because I write, podcast, and lecture about the overlap between psychology and video games. So I have a day job, but I do this psychology of games thing on the side, mainly at psychologyofgames.com. And then I also published a book. Had a book come out a couple of months ago called Getting Gamers, the Psychology of Video Games and Their Impact on the People Who Play Them. Hello? Is that any better? So, short version of what I said is I write and talk about the overlap between psychology and video games. And so that's kind of my angle. Not a game developer. I worked in the game industry for a few years on the gaming enthusiast press side. But beyond that, that's what I got.
My name is Sam Goster. I'm 1/3 of Butterscotch Shenanigans, for those who aren't familiar. And we are a indie game studio here in St. Louis. It's me and my two brothers. And we have produced a few games in the last couple of years. Have about 5 million players between all of them on Android and iOS, and are releasing a huge game on PC called Crashlands in about 2 weeks, which is why I'm shaking because I'm freaking out about it. So we do a lot of work in just actually building games. We got started actually here in St. Louis at the game jams, which are put on by the community and run now by Carol and Wes and a couple other people. And so we're very interested in, from the games changing the world and also changing people perspective. For both me and my brothers, it was very sort of enlightening and very, very opening to actually be people who are creating games, which is a whole other side of the equation to talk about tonight. So.
Cool. Pass it quickly. Hot potato. All right. So, when I got into the game industry, I didn't really think about getting into the game industry. I was just like, I want to make games. I played them a lot as a kid. And I actually just recently had a conversation with my mother a couple of weeks ago, which was really weird and eye-opening. And I realized when I was a little kid, I always wanted to build an empathy machine where like I could immediately give somebody the ability to feel exactly what I was feeling at that very moment, right? So like I was sick and I really wanted my mom to know what I was feeling so she would know exactly how I was sick. Or I was really sad and I really just wanted my parents to understand why I was sad or how I was sad. And I realized that's what drew me to games. That interactivity is my empathy machine. So I was wondering from you guys, from your perspectives, what was it that drew you specifically into the game industry?
Can you hear me now? No, who said no? Let's see. So I've gone into the industry from I guess kind of an indirect way, but maybe not. I was inspired by video games actually to get into film. So that was kind of my first year at university. And I very quickly discovered that going to film school is the best way to end up working on someone else's film, which is not at all what I wanted to do. I wanted to do my own things. I wanted to express my own stories. So instead, I went into business school. That makes sense, right? But the theme there is trying to figure out a way to put into motion the things that will let me tell my own stories. And so through film school, through business school, and teaching myself a variety of the more technical and creative arts, I have ended up where I want to be. And what's drawn me to it really is that video games are kind of this ultimate meta art. A lot of the video games you see now, they are using the best of composers that we have, whether they be standard music you listen to the radio or the top-notch classical artists who do scores for movies.
Actually, recently, the very first game soundtrack was ever nominated for a Grammy recently. I think it was Journey's soundtrack by Austin Wintory. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I kind of see video games as this great intersection of the humanities, all the things that we have always wanted to share and tell stories to each other as a human race, but also an intersection with cutting-edge engineering in terms of how we communicate the graphics, the sounds, everything we can use as an extension of our own voice.
All right. So in terms of how I got into the whole psychology of video games thing, I was one of those people who have played games since I was a kid. Grew up with them all the way from the coin-operated days through the home consoles and playing on the PC and all the connected games of today. And I also like to write. And back around late 2009, I graduated with a PhD in psychology a few years ago. And so I was also always interested in psychology, and I was reading through a lot of these behavioral economics, psychology of decision-making, kind of looking at why do people make decisions the way they do, and big decisions like who to marry, how much to save for retirement, what job should I take, little decisions like what should I have for lunch today. I just got into a spat of reading a lot about that stuff, and I kept thinking like, this really could be applied to video games. It could be used to explain why people do a wide variety of things in games. Or, why do we play the games we want? When are we susceptible to impulse purchases through in-app, purchases within games, and all this different stuff. And I thought, wow, somebody should really write about this. Somebody should really examine this. And then it occurred to me, well, I'm somebody. I guess I can do that.
You're the somebody.
Yeah, you're the somebody is the lesson to take away. And I was also just kind of looking for a blogging project to do, and so I threw up the website and just kind of intended it to be a lark, maybe last like a year at most. And apparently it resonated with a lot of people, and I started to get a lot of people from the gaming industry, game developers, people working in marketing, people working in community management for games, and then people who just liked games were coming to it and kept saying, oh, you should write about this and that, and so forth. And it just sort of took off from there. It's something I continued to do and kept it up on a regular basis. And I think the reason that I still have the interest and the energy around it is that games are so much like natural experiments where you can get a group of people and you can put them in a situation and sort of control the environment, and then you can tinker with things and you can start to understand like, well, what is it about the different game mechanics that makes people behave in different ways? And these really sort of big, important questions, because those answers can then be taken from video games and applied to other contexts, like why do people behave the way they do in the workplace? Why do people behave the way they do socially? And all these other different types of questions. So that has sort of become the running theme of, it started out like, what can psychology, how can that be used to explain why people do things in games the way they do? And now it's almost turning around to be like, why, or how can the way that people do things in games explain why they do things the way they do in other spheres?
If you have real systems, can that translate better into games then?
What's that?
If you have real systems that work in the real world, that can be translated into games, is that a good process also?
Yeah, I think that,
Repeat the question.
yes, if you have real systems in the real world, can they then be grafted or transported onto game systems? Is
Yeah, the reality of it being more developed through the game system by using the vernacular that way.
So, yes, would be the short answer. And I think that that happens because things work and things are motivating in games because they're also motivating in real life. And you make games motivating and you make them addictive and you make them engaging because those are the same characteristics of work and play in real life that cause all those other things.
And we'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the session where we can dive a lot deeper into that sort of thing too.
So my start was weirdly similar, but very different as far as the path. I did undergrad of psychology, and I was always very interested in games, but never thought I could do them because I couldn't program. So I taught myself how to code websites, and then picked up a game for a game jam, or a tool for a game jam called Game Maker Studio, which is actually the engine that we use to build all of our games today. It's a 2D engine, very simple, and I burned through 4 hours of tutorials, and then made a game over a weekend. And this sort of light went off where I was like, oh, okay, this is a thing I can do, actually. So I went back, and about a year and a half later, my brother Seth, who's in the audience up here, the bald guy, he came down here to St. Louis, and we participated in the Global Game Jam, which is coming up in, what, 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
3 weeks, yeah.
And it's a huge event, usually has about 250 people participate. And so he and I did a game jam there, and actually got hired in the parking lot by a game studio. So
It's not shady at all.
yeah, it wasn't shady, but it worked out. And I was supposed to be going to the East Coast to do like database management, so I'm glad it happened. So I worked there for a bit, and actually my job there was head of QA and running psychological, designing and running psych tests on gamers. And so when he was talking about manipulating the environment and then seeing what the feedback was from gamers, we would do really fun and tricky things like just adjust the field of view, so essentially how wide the viewport was that people could see while they're playing. And it had all these sorts of goofy effects on people, make them think the game is going really fast and that they're being way more awesome than they actually are, which is fantastic. But that's essentially what we do. So we have this rule where our goal is to manufacture achievement and to manufacture happiness. That's what we do. So that's kind of how we ended up coming to where we are now.
Cool. Go ahead and keep the microphone. I'm going to let you start off the next question.
This is a good plan.
Can you all hear me when I'm projecting? Okay. So I'm curious how you've seen the landscape of games actually shift since you first got interested in the medium. How have you seen games evolve and grow since you first, even as a child, when you first started playing, until up to the point when you started creating games and actually getting involved in the industry? Where where are the kind of paradigm shifts?
Yeah, so growing up, I grew up in the middle of Iowa, out in the country, so we had to drive an hour to the computer store to get a video game, and there were 2 racks of video games there. It's Comp USA. I don't know if anybody remembers that. Yeah, the 2 racks of video games. Oh, it was the best thing. So you'd save up for months, go there, pick up Diablo or something, read the back cover, pick one, had no idea what was going on. And then we just devour these manuals and stuff on the way home. So that's how that whole thing started. And the transition from then to now is very interesting because of the fact that it's become so easy to make games. And when I say easy, it's not easy to make them. I say easy in the sense that it's easy to not have anybody getting in your way of making them. And truly, the only thing stopping you from actually making games is just the fact that you're for some reason not doing it. There literally is nothing else. And you can publish your stuff for free on things like itch.io. And so all of the gates are just gone. And as a result, you see basically a lot more niche products, right? It's the same thing that happened with the internet, where essentially once everybody could essentially reach every other person on the planet, you can have products that would at one point be impossibly not viable become perfectly viable. I was going to say Crocs as an example because they're so hideous, but that counts. So you end up opening these niche markets, and I think that's the really interesting thing is that you have because a lot of the indie scene and then also the AAA markets. When I say AAA and indie, just as a primer, AAA is sort of kind of like the Hollywood studios. So your games like Grand Theft Auto, Skyrim, these huge 500-person teams taking 4 or 5 years to build a game, and they make Fallout 4, which just launched a few weeks ago, made $750 million in its first week. So they're enormous projects. And the difference is now that those markets are more able to serve niche markets, and so you have a lot more games that are often can be a lot weirder, doing a lot better than anything else.
Yeah, similarly, I grew up with games and I was playing them in the early 80s, and I was an arcade rat, the home of the original microtransaction where you paid 25 cents at a time to play a game. Everything comes full circle sometimes.
Pay more, the worse you are.
That's right. And then, I lived through that, and then there was the home console boom and bust with Nintendo and Sega, and then I saw the rise of, PC gaming, and then the second generation of consoles, and the third, and then, the rise of the internet and indie gaming becoming really viable, low barrier to entry. So, I mean, it's changed a whole lot, but I think one of the most interesting sort of eras that it went through was in the late 1990s and early 2000s when video games and the internet started to intersect, and you started having things like, online games and competitive games and cooperative, and, I just remember the first time, I'd done some stuff like I would play some multiplayer games and this and there, and my friends and I would get our computers together and hook them up via serial ports and play StarCraft or whatever. But it was the first time I played like Quake World, which is where you connected to this server and played a game with a whole group of people who were not there with you in the room, and they were from all over the world. And I'm just like, wow, this is amazing. And of course, just as everybody predicted, it went pretty amazing places. And I think that that intersection of internet and video games has led to a lot of things that are interesting from a psychological perspective, because it means that games are now social. It means that games are now interactive in terms of other people. And it starts to introduce all these things from social psychology about competition, cooperation, identity, signaling things to other people, and how those sorts of things happen when you can't see the other person on the other end of the keyboard, or you're in a group of people that you never met before, and you're starting to do things like substitute relationships online for relationships that you might have had face-to-face, and what are the differences between those, and how do you study those, and what ways are they better or worse. And just, it made video games a lot more interesting to the extent that they were social and interactive with other people. And the era of, being a gamer, when it meant that you were probably just sitting at home, on the couch playing a game by yourself, or in front of a computer playing a game by yourself. And then the social aspect only came in at, the playground or the water cooler when you got together with other people and you talked about what you did. Now, after that, you're really starting to actually do it with other people and involving other people. And I think that is, we're never going to go back. It's never going to be the same, and it's only going to be better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so much has happened. I think it's important to kind of put it into perspective how young the industry is. For some of you, you've had games all your life, while another batch of you can remember a time before video games. But the one thing I can guarantee is most likely your parents, 100%, can remember a time where there were no video games. The industry is that young, where we still have a lot of first generation or second generation players. And so I guess growing up, my memories are very much similar to Sam, where you go to the store and it's like a candy store. It's a surprise what's on the shelf. And I think one change that I guess I'm not as happy about, some of the magic has been lost, is I feel like I know what's coming out 6 months in advance. I don't have that childhood, surprise now when I go to the store and I see something that I had no idea, like, where is this coming from?
So get off Twitter.
Yeah, stop reading, Rob. So a lot of it is definitely the interconnectedness, the internet that Jamie mentioned. I would think that the biggest turning point that I can remember would probably be the App Store on whatever platform of choice that you would prefer. I mentioned before that for some reason I was inspired by video games to get into film. Why wasn't I inspired by video games to get into video games? And that's because as a kid, it was not very apparent to me that video games was an industry that you could enter. We had YouTube at that time when I was making those decisions of what industry should I get in, but we did not yet have an app store. And the two are kind of analogous. YouTube was kind of that democratization of film that said, hey, anyone can be a filmmaker and it doesn't have to be expensive for you to share your creative vision. And the app store was that moment for many people who wanted to get into video game development. As far as changes that are happening now, I kind of use a forest analogy when I talk to my friends about it. If you imagine yourself in a forest, you're alone, you're trying to survive, and you are looking for a helicopter overhead to rescue you. That's one region of the forest. You're the only one there. Helicopter finds you, rescue you. They had no idea that anyone was even there to rescue. The analogy here is the helicopter, they're like consumers. And then you as a person are like a video game waiting to be sold, or any product really. This is kind of like the product life cycle. A lot of what's happening in the industry are people who just want to be discovered. Kind of picture another region of the forest where there's a bunch of you trying to be rescued by a helicopter. There aren't enough helicopters and one person has a flare. And the other group of people says, hey, let's go find a flare. You kind of get all these copycats trying to survive and you start to see the beginnings of saturation. And we're seeing that region also with video games. And then if you imagine a third area, it's a really crowded forest. Everyone's copying each other. And so the helicopters know there are tons of people here to rescue, tons of people to pick up. And so the struggle there is not so much telling people that you were there in the first place, but is setting yourself apart and getting regular supplies. And then the last place is this desolate forest where the helicopters aren't even coming anymore. That dark valley where Mufasa and Simba are reviewing their kingdom and they say we don't go, that's the forest you're in, that is the decline, and that's probably around the time where you need to look at new video games.
That's a hell of a metaphor. Yeah, that metaphor definitely deserved that applause. All right, so I'm really glad that Rob brought up the App Store because to me, mobile gaming is the biggest change that's happened in the game industry. It has meant that games have gone from being a very niche thing, a niche market, of me being a little girl in 7th grade being made fun of for playing video games, for example, to becoming a thing that everybody now has in their pocket, and they spend 5, 10, 15, 2 hours a day just playing on their phones because it's a part of their lives now. And that's why we're seeing so many players. That's why 40% of the world's population are game players. That's incredible. That didn't happen even 5 years ago. That didn't happen 10 years ago. This is a new thing. This means games have permeated culture in such a way that film has, in such a way that books have, and this means that they're only going to be growing and only impacting other elements of culture. We're seeing gamification of apps. We're seeing gamification of ordinary experiences using game-informed interactivity to make them extraordinary experiences. We hadn't seen that before. And even doctors' offices are implementing things like games and stuff to calm down patients. We're seeing, I'm currently working on a project at the Pulitzer Foundation for the Arts that is a game installation in order to help people better understand the works that are on display, in order to help, art literacy. So we're seeing games permeating culture on a level that we never even would have imagined 10 years ago, which is really exciting because interactivity is one of these things that has a way of impacting people a lot deeper than just observation, right? We're actually interacting with the work instead of just standing there and just trying to understand it. So how have you all seen games impact other industries and other facets of culture beyond just the game industry itself?
I love the psychology stuff, but I'll let you guys have out. Let's see, more film stuff. How many of you remember a time before DVDs? Hopefully everyone. DVDs, Blu-rays, it's almost like a no-brainer. But when those came out, it wasn't a given that those technologies would be successful. Yeah, exactly. So what happened, and this is a process that there's a lot to learn here from a business success perspective, but it's a recurring process. If you learn history, you start to see the patterns and you can figure out how to succeed with it. So when DVD came out, and I remember going to the store and being told all these cool things about, oh, it's like movies on a music disc kind of thing. And you see these DVDs, and they're like $600 to $1,000 for a DVD player. You can get them for $30 now, but there was a time. Then along comes the Sony PlayStation 2, at probably about $350 to $400, includes the DVD player as an afterthought, because this is for gamers. They're probably going to buy a $250 game console anyway, but through complementary bundling of products, the DVD was allowed to succeed because of video games. And the process repeated itself, and you can see both the success and failure with the next generation, with Blu-rays. The big war there was Blu-rays versus HD DVDs. And Sony just did it again. You had Blu-ray players from anywhere for $500 to $1,000. And then they made the PlayStation 3 for $600. It's almost a no-brainer then. If you're going to be a video game player, get the Blu-ray player also, you can enjoy the top movies. They just repeated that. It worked again. Example of a company that didn't do it right, Microsoft. They made the complementary product, the Xbox 360. You could play HD DVDs, which were the competing equivalent, but they didn't build it in. About the same price, but buy it separately. And so the economics there's a really cool thing happening in the video game industry, is that video gamers, they're tied in. They can be expected to continue to participate, but if you want to create new technologies, explore new ways of input, new ways of sharing things with people, if you combine it with video games, the economics of that industry are such that you can actually make new hardware succeed, whereas it would have failed by itself.
So I think you did the hardware and software side, the question justice. So I'll, again, go figure, talk about some of the social and psychological ways that video games are impacting other industries. And I think the two biggest ones that come to mind for me are gamification, especially in the workplace, but also in sort of consumerism, and also education, how games are being used to improve education. So gamification, for those of you who may not be familiar, is just taking game-like elements and applying them to a serious context. Most often it's the workplace. So for example, how do we use aspects of games to make employees happier, more productive, make them stick around with their job longer, make them, have whatever good habits we want to, have them to have, develop themselves professionally or what have you. And I think the industry, or I think the science is not quite there yet on gamification. I think there's a lot of interesting research that's going on there, but a lot of it seems to be like a gold rush towards something that seems really cool and that intuitively makes sense, and it needs to be studied more. But that's sort of beside the point, because you're obviously seeing it. I mean, all sorts of companies are building games out of clearing your email inbox and awarding achievements and badges and trophies for doing various things that are part of their job, or maybe not necessarily part of their job. And you're also seeing it in consumer products where you get rewards for customer loyalty and so forth. And that stuff's not new, obviously, but the way that it's packaged and presented and the way that the feedback is delivered relies a lot about what we know makes for effective games and motivating games. It's the timing of the feedback, and it's the way it's presented, and it's the way that you are compared to other people to motivate you or not, that is being applied to these systems and these practices that have been happening for a while. So I think that's one of the major places where games are having an impact on other industries. Again, I really want to see scientific, peer-reviewed research happen that looks at the effectiveness of that sort of stuff. Because I think that a lot of times think like, well, let's just slap a badge or a trophy up there, and that's going to motivate people. And sometimes you can do that, for example, without really understanding like, well, what is it about the activity that's motivating? Is it that people get to have autonomy and choose their own path? Is it that they get feedback? Is it they get a sense of mastery? And the sort of underlying second level factors aren't really being looked at and examined. And that's where I think a lot of the scientific research that's happening around the fields of psychology and communications and sociology applied to video games can really help, because you have experiments and proper methods and adequate samples that go into really sort of refining theories about why these things work in games, and then that can be used to understand how to make them work in gamification. It can also be used to help understand how to make education better. So there's been a lot of experimental classrooms where people are applying game concepts to the classroom and turning assignments into games, and turning teams of students into competing or cooperating groups, and applying game layers and game mechanics to that sort of stuff.
Do you mind if I actually cut in with some statistics that I found?
Go for it.
74% of K through 8 teachers actually have reported to use games in the classroom. That's a lot of people using games in the classroom. And instructors actually report that use of video games increases the motivation and engagement of their students. 4 out of 5 video game implementing teachers use games created exclusively for educational purposes. That's huge.
Yeah, and so like you said, it's a mixture of both games that, it's like using Minecraft in the classroom to help illustrate urban planning, for example, or using civilization to help teach history or macroeconomics or any of those sorts of things. But there's also a lot of people developing games, a lot of companies developing games that are being custom made for specific topics, like to teach physics or to teach other history or whatever it is that you want to teach. So it's a huge industry from what I can see.
I want to talk about viruses and the Xbox Connect. Are you guys familiar with Xbox Connect? Everybody's familiar with viruses. It's been a real culture thing. But the Xbox Connect, everybody knows what that is. Yeah, so those are familiar. It's got 2 eyeballs. It's a camera that watches you while you play Xbox games. It's extremely creepy. And essentially what it actually does, so it comes bundled with a bunch of software where it builds a model of the room you're in. It'll build a model of you by watching you with its creepy eyes. And you can do things like dance for this. You dance for the machine to play a game. I'm not kidding at all. And you have to like match your silhouette, while the dance moves are going. You get points for this. So that's a cool piece of tech, right? Very cool. And going back to what Rob was talking about tech adoption, there's another really interesting thing with video game tech in particular, which is that it's usually extremely complicated. So that problem of using a robot essentially a computer program to build a model of a room that is actively being updated as a person running around very accurately, that's a huge problem to solve. And the fact that this Connect was a thing you could get with your Xbox meant that suddenly some PhD carrying scientist who couldn't get their hands on extremely expensive equipment before that did the same thing could just go buy an Xbox and get a Connect. Not only could they dance in their living room, but then they could strap this thing onto a locomotion device and actually build themselves a nice little robot that could walk around. And on top of that, they found all sorts of other uses for this thing. I'm pretty sure there's some guy, correct me if I don't know if you guys heard this, who used it because it has such creepy vision. You can like detect people's blood, like heart rate with the thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Looking at skin, like the color of their skin. You can
Right.
influence their heart rate.
So it's a creepy thing, okay? But it's extremely useful in the fact that it becomes
science.
It's science, right? So the fact that it becomes ubiquitous because of or very available because of technology means that hacking is the hackers get tools, right? And this is very important for just sort of the other side growth of the industry, which is that when people get stuff like the new Oculus that just came out or just got pre-orders went out 2 days ago, that's the thing you literally strap it to your face. Oh, these things are terrible. You strap it to your face, so you're wearing a big black, like a night mask that is 4 inches deep, and inside of it are 2 lenses. And so what actually happens is it creates again stereoscopic vision for you. So now you see as if you are in a 3D world for real, not just looking at a flat version of a 3D world. This makes a lot of people throw up, which they're still working on. But the cool thing about it is, again, they just announced the price. It's $600 for these things. And yes, it's expensive right now, comparatively, but it lets you build these experiences that people have not been able to build before. And they have a controller coming out for it soon, which is sort of held like this, and it detects it has fingers, I believe, and it detects your full range of motion in your wrist and everything like that. And so people are talking about being able to build games where your arms are actually fully controllable by you, which is totally different. So there's a lot of interesting things on the hacking side. And then when I talk about viruses, there was this group that did, so there's a big problem in science, which is that proteins fold themselves. So the basic sort of building blocks of yourself, a protein folds itself in a very complicated way depending on what molecules it's built out of. And you can build really, really intense computer algorithms to solve this problem, or you can give it to, like, I don't know, 10,000 people and turn it into a game of protein folding and see how long it takes them. And apparently it only took them, you know, it was like a week or two, a couple weeks to figure out this sort of clutch protein for, I don't know, what some viral thing, who knows? But the point is, they essentially, this game still exists, it's a protein folding game, and basically they crowdsourced the folding of these proteins to humans, because human brains are very, very good at a bunch of things that computers are terrible at, using the power of a sort of gaming technology. And of course 3D and all these other things sort of come about in the same way that this Connect situation did. So that's a big way that they impact stuff.
To kind of add to the health focus, besides the protein folding thing, I think they said that it went a whole century faster than if they had done it by themselves, which is ridiculous because that's how many lifetimes of information that were produced. But the beautiful thing about video games is there's a really thin line, and sometimes the line isn't even there, between something that is an entertaining simulation and something that is actually an educational tool. So kind of on that same topic, there was a game called Plague Inc., where you play as a virus. Your goal is to kill everyone on the planet by designing your own virus. And it was super fun, super addicting. I lost that. Yeah, but it was recognized by the World Health Organization as a tool that actually does teach very accurately the ways that diseases spread and the ways we can prevent it. And not only did it help, not only can these games help simulate real data that makes a difference in the lab, they help raise awareness, and they also help bring people into industries that otherwise might have looked really boring, which is really important. Then even from the social side, when you say psychology, they have all these cool stories of social experiments that will never be done again because it turned out they were really unethical. Like locking people in basements and simulating prisons and stuff like that. The fun thing is, you get away with a lot of really unethical stuff in video games. And it doesn't always have to be very rude fun. Sometimes it can actually be an experiment. So one of my favorite recent ones is there's a Japanese video game maker who grew up in the Cold War, and so for 2 decades he has been making anti-war war games. He makes war games where the theme is to teach you, his message about being against war. And he's built a social experiment into his latest game where players run their own private military companies. And in the course of doing private military company stuff, you can develop nuclear weapons. You can also choose to dismantle other people's nuclear weapons. And so for the very first time, and maybe they've tried to simulate this in the classroom, but they've never been able to do it with 25 million players before, is there's this war going on in this game where part of the game will not unlock unless every player in the game decides, hey, we are going to dismantle all the nuclear weapons in this game universe. And so social experiments like those, maybe to some people might just be, artistic fluff. But that approach can be used in other circles, especially academically, to simulate things where you definitely could not do that one in real life, for example.
So I'm going to build off that in a second, but I would also like to talk about something called serious games, which is a big part of the game industry that I guess a lot of people realize it exists, and a lot of people don't associate it necessarily with games itself, but these are your training games, like military training, flight training, medical training, things like this. This is all game-informed interactivity. These are all essentially just games created to put you in that experience. So the interesting thing about games is that unlike other media, like I mentioned, you're interacting with this thing. You're actually having this experience with this media, as opposed to just watching a training video. You're actually participating in the training process without putting anybody at risk. And that is something that without games we wouldn't have. And it makes training a lot safer, it makes training a lot less expensive, it makes training a lot less risky in general. On the social side of things, what's been interesting as games evolve into a more fully formed creative medium. We're seeing creators, I mean, in film, we see documentary. In books, we see nonfiction work. In games, we're beginning to see nonfiction or fictional, metaphorical, and biographical games that put you in a situation that you would never be in otherwise. And so even going beyond video games, a man named Akira Thompson actually created a live-action RPG about the interaction between the system and the subject in response to the situation in Ferguson and the Black Lives Matter movement. And it offers players a chance to actually experience that which they could never otherwise. A player plays as the subject, and they go through an experience where if they land on a specific spot, the player playing the system needs to literally roll a die. And if they roll anything higher than a 1, they have to refer to a book to see how they would respond. And it's just a really interesting situation to put people who would never otherwise have any concept of what that feeling is in a situation where they might actually be able to feel 1 iota of what people who experience that on a regular basis do. And so that's how we're seeing game creators actually take advantage of the interactive medium, of the actual immersive side of things, in order to create experiences that would not otherwise exist. So I'm curious how you all foresee games continuing to evolve in this way or in other ways in order to affect our culture, or more simply, how can games change the world?
I think games are going to become so pervasive that we stop seeing them kind of as this separate, thing. Like, oh, you're a gamer? Like, you don't see people say, oh, you read books? Or you watch movies? I think it's a natural, because it is a natural expression, extension of human expression, it will become the norm. In schools, you have the classics that you learn, and like 1984, what did you think of Big Brother or Brave New World? People discuss in an academic and even in their entertainment setting what they thought of different books. I think we will reach a point in society, and definitely in education, where they will ask you not about what you just thought about what you read, but also what you did. And that is a level of interactivity and immersion that is only afforded by interactive media such as games.
So I may be a little blasé to say that obviously the technology of games is going to continue to drive forward technology in other areas. We had in the early 2000s advances in like 3D graphics acceleration defined a whole market, and now that hardware and that technology is in phones now, and it sort of drove the popularity of it. And I think another thing that, fingers crossed, I think may blow up real big is virtual reality, like we were talking about earlier, with the consumer level VR kits like the Oculus Rift, where you can put something on your face and be in another world. And that, to the extent that that technology can develop and become easily available to anyone, you can start seeing that sort of stuff being used in education and the workplace and training. Even outside of a games context, it's just the fact that this stuff was developed and made popular, and that there was a market for it, is going to have benefits for everyone else. Again, I think that the research, the scientific research in psychology and related fields that's going on is going to be real valuable later on. There's finally researchers who grew up, with Mario and Zelda and the Doom Marine or whatever, and they want to study what they loved as a kid and what they, the hobby that they still play now, and apply it to other avenues. And those are the people who are starting to be in control of funding budgets for research. They're the ones who are writing all the grants and grant applications, and they're the ones that are hiring associate professors to work for them and take on graduate students who have interests similar to theirs. And so that's going to help define the academic field. And you're seeing the academic study of video games grow really, really fast. Even in 2009, when I started writing about the topic, there were people doing it. They just weren't doing it very openly, and they weren't sort of sharing their research and their results with the world at large. You're starting to see that a lot more now. You're seeing BBC specials about academic research on video games. You're starting to see academics moved from university labs to working for game development companies to head up entire groups of people that are looking at problems like toxic behavior in game, harassment in games, and like how do we design our systems and our community management tools to get people to behave themselves better and be more sportsmanlike, for example. You're also seeing that a lot of those people turn their attention to how do we get people to spend 99 cents at a time, in our game, and how do we get them to buy the booster packs, and how do we get them to buy the coin doubler, or subscribe to our product, or what have you. So that stuff is being, the popularity and the rise of academic research on video games is starting to affect those types of industries as well.
I think it sounds kind of obvious, but I think games are going to make the world be a more playful place. I think as it kind of should be, and I mean that in a loose sense as well, with the ideas of gamification. What that really means for most people is really just to focus on usability and feedback and sort of getting some sort of joy out of the product you're using or the experience you're having. And I think when you're able to go home from work, where you're sort of doing some drudgery, and then play a game for 6 hours where you lose track of time, your mind's being blown, your fingers are bleeding from hitting the keyboards hard. And then you ask the question, how come I just did work? I mean, games make you work, because you can fail at them. That's all you do. You have to work in a game. Anybody who's played something like World of Warcraft or Candy Crush, it's literally what you do. You're working, and we're getting you to work a lot for something that doesn't matter at all. So the question is, how is it possible that something like a job can do such a poor job of making you want to work for something that actually does matter in a material context in terms of your health and livelihood. So I think when we approach that saturation point, as we are pretty much getting to now, where everybody has had these experiences, where they've had a lot of this joy and stuff just sort of happen to them, there's going to be the question of why can't other parts of my life be like this? And then I think the most interesting part is going to come from those answers in the future.
So my closing thoughts were, games can encourage empathy, reveal truths about oneself and about others. They can offer comfort and educate through play. Games can encourage deeper thought, a unique approach or an alternative way to experience something. Games can make the ordinary extraordinary. They can make the tedious enjoyable. So with that, I'd like to open it up to Q&A. If you all had any questions or any thoughts that you would like to pose to the panelists up here, we have about 10 minutes.
I just want everyone to know that Luke Coleman, the author of Innovation Games, which is related to serious games, will be giving a keynote here in St. Louis at Worldwide Technology on Wednesday night. And I'll post the link in the Facebook invite.
Okay.
So
So there's a Facebook event for this panel that he is going to post a link to an event that is a keynote by a thought leader on serious games.
Yeah, Luke Coleman, the author of Innovation Games.
Luke Coleman, cool, the author of Innovation Games. So if you're interested in serious games, learning more about that, that talk's going to be at Worldwide Technology when?
Wednesday at 6 p.m.
Wednesday at 6 p.m. So keep your eye, if you're not already on the Facebook event for this, just search for Can Games Change the World and you should be able to pull it up. He's going to post the link there. Yes? You, on the floor. Thank you for sitting the entire time on the floor. And thank the rest of you for standing.
What advice would you give educators or business people that are apprehensive or unsure of implementing game-based in their environments?
I think one of the biggest misperceptions is that it's something really artificial that has to be strapped on. I think it definitely depends on a lot of the details and the context, but the most general advice I would give is to figure out a way to naturally slip it in.
My advice would be to learn at least something about game design and talk to game designers. Because again, like I said, it's not just the superficial level of, you got a trophy. It's why was chasing that trophy motivating, and why did you want to do that? And I think that's something that the game designer, that's what they live and breathe every day, right? They're trying to design products that make you want to get the trophy, not have the trophy.
Yeah, we've actually been brought in for consultation specifically for that, not like as like self-promotion right now, but we actually have worked with companies. You know, it's not unheard of to actually reach out to game designers and say, how can we make this fun? That's something that I definitely encourage you. I mean, whether it's these people or any of the other game developer co-op members, I mean, we all have experience making fun. We do that for a living. So, any other questions?
What if you are like a designer of something like a city, and you help to design a city, and it's functional and it works, and most of it's in St. Louis, but is that...
Can you apply game-informed interactivity to city planning, is what you're asking?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah, why not? I actually, I actually have a friend in Paris who's doing that in Paris, as just part of his job, so.
One little detail about that, I'm blanking on the name of the book, but I recently read a collection of essays, and anybody familiar with the game Counter-Strike, first-person shooter, competitive? Most popular map in Counter-Strike is called DE Dust. It's sort of one of the most well-known maps. And in this essay, the guy wrote about how he applied city planning and civil engineering axioms to the design of that map. And it's really interesting. He drew some direct lines.
I'll try to dig that up and maybe post a link to the Facebook page as well.
But that's a direct line.
Any other questions? Yeah. I can't see your face. Yes, you, right.
I have a daughter who's in high school, and she's very interested in graphic design. She's been doing art as long as I can remember. Is there anything that comes up in St. Louis for like high school age, where they can do like maybe workshops or summer camps or anything to learn more about game design? Any suggestions?
Yes, so there's a facility called the Youth Learning Center here in St. Louis where they offer classes specifically for youth in STEAM education, and they do offer game design classes. Another thing that I can strongly encourage her to look into is the Global Game Jam. So a game jam, how many of you are familiar with hackathons? A game jam's a hackathon, but you make video games, and it's great. We try to host a few game jams per year in St. Louis. The next one is coming up in 3 weeks. It's the Global Game Jam at UMSL, all ages. If you're under 18, you just can't stay past 9 p.m. without a supervisor. But it is a 48-hour overnight sort of deal, and it's a great way to immerse yourself in making a game because you go in not with a game and you come out with a game, and it's great. Beyond that, the St. Louis Game Developers Co-op, you can find out more information about events that we host on stlgamedev.com. We have a meetup group, we have a Facebook group, and we host at least monthly educational events that are, again, all ages. Sometimes we drop some curse words, if you're all right with that. But we have kids, that are like 7, 8 years old who come to these things, and they don't seem to mind. Any other questions? Yes.
I really enjoyed the discussion, how expansive it was, and how idealistic and educational games can be to bring people together. Things. I have a friend who's in the club who's very much more into video games than I am, and he was too busy playing a game to come tonight.
I can identify.
But I was curious, maybe our doctor here may have some ideas and some of the research implications on like antisocial or non-social behavior due to being too involved in games.
My general read on that is, yes, it's a thing. So people are addicted to things, but it's not generally as widespread as you might think from the media or understanding. And I'm talking about true clinically diagnosable addiction in this case. I think there's a lot of other interesting research going on about people who get really involved in games, and especially like massively multiplayer games where they start to replace other life activities with playing that game. So like you said, instead of going out and interacting with a bunch of people and meeting some new people, they stay at home and go on a raid, or they stay at home and play this game. And there's been some really interesting research looking at like what are the characteristics of those online relationships and how are they different from traditional face-to-face relationships. And a lot of the research has come out and had some interesting things like, look, in some ways they're better because you can be more disclosing in some ways with people that you're anonymous to or that you've only met online. But in some ways they're not as good. Like they don't offer you as much social support, or they don't help you out when you're in trouble as much. And so there's a lot of interesting research there. Rachel Cohort is one of the researchers that I would point you to looking at that sort of stuff.
I would just follow up with that also with, historically speaking, you know, every generation has been like, oh God, the children are addicted to books. Oh no, the movies are taking, or the talkies are taking over. You know, so I mean, we see that with every new media. It's engaging, it's exciting, people love it, and it's new and it's scary to the grown-ups. But I mean, like you said, addiction is addiction, and it's going to happen to anyone with anything. I mean, I've been addicted to Netflix. You had a question?
Yeah. So you guys talked a lot about how games are another way to tell a story, another way to be more immersive. And I guess like in movies and in books, you see trends. You know, over the decades, you see trends about ideas that are touched on in those mediums. So I was just curious, like, if you guys know of any trends right now in video games that reflect what's going on in our society in that sense.
Does anybody? I mean, so just from my perspective, I'm sorry, I do have, thank you for your patience with me. I'm seeing personally, I play a lot of indie games, and so in the indie game scene, I see a lot of post-apocalyptic things, specifically as related to what would happen if we screwed our world up thanks to global warming or something like that. And I just recently completed a game called Submerge, which was about a post-apocalyptic world that has been completely submerged except for this one city. And it was like, not specifically saying, this is what's going to happen to the world, but it was like, this is an example of what the world could be. And it was really interesting and got me thinking, like, how many other post-apocalyptic games are trying to basically say exactly that?
I think for me, this kind of comes back to the four forests analogy, where each forest kind of represents a different trend. And so, you know, you kind of have your mature genres where you see a war game every single year. You see endless shooter games every single year. But one of my favorite trends that I'm seeing, especially in the indie space, are postmodern games. Games that are commentary on themselves for being a video game. And when you have an art medium, and so I'm calling games art in this case, that is able to comment on itself, the variety of what you find is just as numerous as many authors who can write about it, because they're basically writing about themselves, so that does kind of jump back into biography there. Other trends I've seen are kind of more technical. There have been some years where they really figured out how to render water really well. And so you'll see 20 games about water, underwater cities, or boat-based games, and so there's some trends where they're kind of going for that flashiness.
Might be coming at your question a little sideways, but I think one of the things that's really interesting to me in the last few years has been retro games, and the real interest in not only remaking old properties, but making new properties that look like old games, and sort of that attack. And it's really interesting. I had a whole chapter on nostalgia in my book, not to be a plug or anything, but you know, it's interesting the way that marketers play on nostalgia and sort of the timing, depending on what group that they're looking at. Of, you know, let's go after games that they played when they were in their late teens and 20s, and it's just a real interesting mix, because when you start to look at nostalgia, one of the things you find out is that it's a very social emotion. Like most people, when they think about being nostalgic, they think about relationships that they've had with family or friends. It's not just I did something that I enjoyed, it's I did something with someone, or I was in a relationship with someone. And like I was talking about earlier, with the way the video games are becoming more and more social every passing year, you know, you're playing with people, even if you're playing a single player game, you're comparing your scores and your information, your achievements to other people. There's a real interesting sort of intersection of nostalgia and social aspects of gaming that I think is being capitalized on by not only by people doing retro games, but just, you know, relaunching old properties as well.
Is anybody familiar with League of Legends?
Yes.
So this is a 5v5. Think about it like basketball with lasers, fireballs, guns, all that stuff. And it's a huge thing. It's actually the biggest game on the planet right now. They have over 69.7 million active users every month. And they have esports. So going back to the question of kind of what's trends happening, esports is becoming a very real, very big thing. I think Counter-Strike is trying to get into the Olympics, I believe. I heard that the other day. So lots of people are trying to get that to be a thing. And so it's basically in a very large sense, they started having scandals last year where people were, doing stuff behind the scenes to say, okay, if you win, I'll let you win. You guys split half the money with us. And someone said, as soon as you start having scandals, you're a real sport. So, so I think that's kind of where it is.
Oh,
Yeah.
you're shutting us out. All right. I just want to follow that up really quickly with things that are near and dear to my heart. Actually, we're seeing a lot of trends in the indie scene where we're seeing pushback against violence, which is great. It's games about people. It's games about real situations that don't involve shooting and killing and punching and stabbing. And that's wonderful to see. Again, biographical games and art games, story games, poetry as games, things like that. We're seeing the medium take on new forms, and that's really, really exciting to me. itch.io is a really great place to find new and unique games like that. So before we close out, I know that we're 3 minutes over time, but I want to give the panelists an opportunity to let you know how to get in contact with them. Once again, my name is Carol Mertz. You can find more information about the St. Louis Game Dev Co-op at stlgamedev.com. You can find me on Twitter at Carol Mertz, and the St. Louis Game Dev Co-op at stlgamedev.
If you do the social media thing, you can find me on Twitter at Rob M. Santos. If you need an email, I've got cards. I haven't yet chosen a pen pal for 2016, so if you would like to, set that up too.
It's Jamie Madigan, and just go to psychologyofgames.com. You'll find links there to my Twitter, Facebook, the book, and podcast, and everything else.
Buy Jamie's book. It's called Hidden Gamers at a bookstore near you.
That's good. At bscotchshenanigans, or just Google butterscotch or games or butterscotch, you'll find it. It's a very unique name.
My special thanks goes to everybody who stood up that entire hour. Thank you so much for being here.